I guess one of the things that the task force wanted me to talk about first is why I joined the task force, not right at the beginning, but at a reasonably strategic time. And I think it's important. VMOs were aware of the issues that these contracts posed. We just weren't aware that there was an almost parallel resistance movement going on in the task force. But when it became apparent that these problems were common to both VMOs and SMOs, particularly the problems which attacked our clinical autonomy, it was a very easy decision to take up the invitation to join the task force. And I should say that Roxanne Wu, a vascular surgeon from Cairns, has also assisted enormously in assessing VMO issues on the task force. The other reason why many of you should be interested who are not VMOs is that apart from the commonality of these issues, I know that some of my SMO colleagues have said that they'll never again be caught with all their eggs in their own basket, so many of you may be considering transferring over to a VMO contribution to the state, so some of this would be quite interesting to you. The other reason why we were very keen as VMOs to support the SMOs is that we work side by side in the hospitals, and as I've said before, none of us wanted to visit a hospital that was staffed by disillusioned and disenfranchised staff specialists, because that's really going to cause an enormous burden on the teamwork in the hospitals. So obviously when I was first asked to join the task force, I didn't really understand what it was, but I learnt fairly quickly. I learnt that it wasn't actually a bunch of left-wing militant unionists, in spite of what the various government propagandas might have suggested. Our big concern with the VMO contract, obviously the major issues, as Hao has just gone over, where there were fatal commonalities with the SMO contract. But there are some additional VMO-specific issues, and many of us were extremely concerned regarding recommendations coming out of the VMO committee in February, March, and even as late as April. One of the things that's really important to realise is that in the new climate of distrust, the old gentleman's agreement that many of us have been working on under for over a decade really is unsatisfactory. And one of the other things to remember is that medical employment, by its very nature, tends to put us in potential conflict with our employer because we have a primary responsibility to our patients. And as a consequence, if we are under coercive command and control contracts, then the old gentleman's agreement was really a very unsafe position for us. And I received a lot of support from that extremely left-wing militant group, the Australian Society of Orthopaedic Surgeons. And as many of you know, we provided what really couldn't be criticised for being anything other than independent medical advice. And one of the things that Stephen Milgate, who helped me a lot in a lot of these issues, said is that if you are facing a coercive employment contract, then under this medical conflict that puts you in conflict with your employer, that requires absolute legal redress to dispute resolution. So our goals in contract negotiations were to clarify VMO roles, and particularly our capacity to conduct a private practice whilst providing a service to the public system. And a lot of these things were at risk in the original contracts, and we've managed to get a lot of safeguards in there to protect that. Obviously that relationship needed defining, and we also needed a remuneration framework that reflects value for VMOs. And those of you who have been VMOs for long enough will remember that we went for many years without even an agreement, and that situation will never happen again, because for the first time VMOs have got access to binding arbitration of their pay and remuneration conditions, so I think that's a really big plus for us. In terms of on-call, some of these are perhaps a little bit esoteric, but they are important. Many of the VMOs actually provide 24-hour call because there are no staff specialists who provide those services. And up until this point, we actually weren't allowed to do call between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. So we just provided the service gratis, and there were also some indemnity issues with that. Under the new agreement, by agreement, a VMO can actually provide 24-hour call, and you'll actually get paid for 24-hour call, which makes you actually feel like what you're providing is being respected. The other thing is that we've managed to get a statement into the contract which expressly recognises the need for a VMO to continue working in private when they're on call publicly. Obviously, we've all managed this conflict on a practical basis, but I think in the current climate it's important that our contract actually reflects the fact that we're providing this service, but we still have to run our private practices, and so there is a very clear statement in that in the contract. The callbacks has been fairly controversial. I know both SMOs and VMOs are a little bit confused about the benefits or disadvantages of rolling everything from a 1.5 versus 2 into a 1.6. One conversation I did have with the Director General was that if you can show after a year that the majority of your call-ins are after midnight, then there is some method of negotiating it with your hospital service to improve the situation. So I just say to all of you, both VMOs and SMOs, that if you do feel, I know that some of the emergency doctors, most of their call-ins are after midnight, and certainly most of my call-ins are after midnight, that you can actually have that reviewed after a year. The other thing which was in the old agreement, there was a pro rata restriction. So if you were a 0.2 or 0.1 VMO, you could only be asked to do a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 10. And if you provided a greater service, you could make agreements. And that's been put into the contract again. And as we used to do, is that we made an agreement we would provide a greater frequency of call for hand surgery. With the proviso, we were allowed to do the call from an hour away from the hospital instead of half an hour. And we were only able to get that because of this agreement, and that's now in the contract. The other thing is that Q Health has accepted that your core hours, as you work, should be what the base hours are in your contract. So many VMOs have these old hangovers from the sessional things with a 3-hour session, but their operating list might go 4 hours every week. And so you need to ensure when you're signing your contract that from the outset the contracted hours reflect your actual hours, because otherwise you're going to have to go through the process of putting in AVACs and it gets quite complex. So it's very important at the time of negotiation that you make sure. A lot of people have said to me that they do 15 hours a week, but their contract came out with 12 hours a week, for example, and that was a reflection of the multiples of sessions. With overtime, there's been some suggestion that it should be annualised, and there was actually a black hole in the VMO contract where we couldn't actually be paid if our session ran over, but it didn't go over 9 hours. And so we've managed to get an agreement there whereby if your session runs over contiguously with your core hours, if it's between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m, then you get paid at single time but you accrue leave. And most importantly, if you work after 6 p.m. with a run over of your session, then you get paid at the overtime rate. In terms of location and rostering, this was a very important thing for us because obviously the government's capacity to change location and rostering on a VMO is potentially very significant interference in your private practice, and this is where we pushed very hard to get the notification period for resignation being the same as the roster changes. So roster changes need 3 months, and if it's really an issue you can always resign with 3 months notice, which means you can never be forced into a situation where your public work conflicts with your private work. And the location changes can be run through the dispute resolution procedure that Luke will talk about, which means that you can't be forced to go and work at a hospital that is going to impact significantly on your existing practice. The other thing was relieving. We were somewhat concerned that the contract for VMOs identified that we could be made to do any duties for which we were qualified. And that has been modified to say that that can only happen in emergent circumstances. So obviously if there's a mass casualty and everyone has to go and assess patients in the emergency department, that's perfectly okay. Many VMOs do fee for service at a DVA rate after hours in regional centres, and that was extended to include Townsville Hospital. We didn't have a leave loading in the original contract, so that's been put into the new contract. One thing that's worth noting is the PDA and fuel allowance from the old VMO agreement. The quantum's been preserved. The only difference is it's going to be paid in a fortnight. This information from VMOs, he said it was for fatigue management, but he backed away from that when I said, so you're saying that if my private list on a Wednesday night goes late, I can not turn up to my public session and still get paid. And the argument about fatigue was probably just some flim-flam. Ultimately, what we agreed upon was that the individual doctor would make his own decisions about how much of this detail he would provide, and he accepted that for a VMO at least, saying that when you're not working publicly, you're working privately would probably get you over the line. So, as he said, it's up to the HHS to pursue you over the level of detail. And if your detail is deficient, it's entirely possible the administrators have probably got other things to think about. So I would suggest you're very careful about how much detail you put in Schedule 1. One particularly significant issue for a small group is there are a number of people working around the state who are effectively VMOs but have been put onto an SMO fractionated contract by their HHS. They have a full-time busy private practice, and what we identified is if those people sign an SMO contract, then they do not have any of these protections that we've engineered into the VMO contract. We managed to get a commitment from the Health Minister that these people should be given a VMO contract when they translate across. So I would recommend anybody who is on a fractionated SMO contract and running a full-time private practice should ask for a VMO contract. If you have any problems with that, then you should contact your relevant industrial representative. And also it can be escalated up to the Health Minister because he's given his word on that to a couple of us on the task force. So just a final thing about collaboration amongst us. This is an interesting photo which I took late on Friday night when the negotiations were on a knife edge, and we weren't sure, and it's just interesting to see who's in this picture. You've got Siva from the task force, you've got Steve from AMA Federal, you've got Peter Somerville, the really excellent ASMOV Federal Director, you've got Nick Buckmaster from ASMOV Q, and you've got Luke. And this shows there's so many people have been involved in this, and Luke's greatest contribution in all of this was that he's absolutely and eternally cured me from ever using the phrase union lawyer as a derogatory term. So I think, as many people have suggested, this is about the collegiality of medicine, and I think that politicians are really jealous of what we have, and we've seen SMOs and VMOs stand side by side. We've seen unions, ASMOV and Together work side by side. We've seen AMA work with the unions, and I think we all need to remember that. And going forward, it's really important that we don't drop our vigilance. And so I couldn't resist putting in this quote that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and remember that we need not only look after our employment but the employment of our future generations. And particularly for VMOs, I would encourage every VMO who's working for Queensland Health that you must join one of the two unions, because they are the ones that have really pushed the industrial representation and got us over the line. Thank you.